Hello, everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to another webinar organized by the Hyve. Today, we continue our journey through innovative approaches in drug safety monitoring, exploring the capabilities of knowledge graphs and semantic web technologies. I'm your host, Elpida Kontsioti, a data modeler at the Hyve, and I'm excited to guide you through today's webinar. So before we dive into the session, let's cover a few housekeeping details. First of all, a quick heads up. This webinar is being recorded for your convenience, and the recording will be made available online shortly after the event. So as we progress through this live session, we invite your questions, and you can share them in the questions box at the bottom right of your screen. We aim to address as many questions as time allows during the Q&A following the main presentation of this webinar. And for those questions we will not manage to get to due to time restriction, we will follow up with you via email after the session. Now, let's take a look at today's agenda. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Andrew Sims, who is going to introduce us to a patient safety knowledge graph supporting vaccine product development. And following the presentation, we will transition into a panel discussion where we will touch upon how knowledge graphs are reshaping the data management landscape for drug safety, but also other R&D domains in pharma, and how knowledge graphs can change our ability to answer critical scientific and medical questions, but also the way we perform data analytics. So the entire session is gonna run for an hour, and we will conclude at 5 p.m. Central European Time. So before we proceed, once again, thanks for joining us today. And to kickstart our session, we would love to learn more about our audience. So we're gonna post some poll questions that will pop up in your screen. So please take a moment to answer those as they come along. So first of all, we would love to know about your professional domain. Nice. I can see like the audience looks quite a mix of different professional domains, so that's always nice. All right, so let's move on to the next poll question about familiarity with knowledge graphs. So please take a moment to answer what is your level of familiarity. Impressive. So I see like all participants have some level of familiarity with knowledge graphs. That's nice. Well, another nice question, what you aim to gain from today's webinar? Good. It's a lot about practical applications, but yeah, also about insights and strategies. So nice. And you can see the results, of course, in your screen as well as they appear. And finally, we would love to know if you are currently considering knowledge graphs into your projects, into your pipelines. Nice. Again, like a good balance. between these answers. Okay, so thanks a lot for your engagement, very much appreciated. And I think it's time that we move on to the main presentation of today's webinar. And for that, I would like to introduce our invited speaker for today, Andrew. Please join the stage.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. So joining us from Gig Harbor, Washington State in the US, we are very happy to have Dr. Andrew Sims with us today. So Andrew is an affiliate assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine and also a principal quantitative scientist at Verana Health. Holding a master's and a PhD in biomedical health informatics, Andrew's research focus is medical knowledge representation with an emphasis on graph-based models. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Andrew joined forces at AstraZeneca, where he contributed to the development of the knowledge graph solution for AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine that he will present to us today. So without further ado, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you very much for that introduction, Elpida. So today I'm going to talk to you about the patient safety knowledge graph. This is a project that I worked on at AstraZeneca during the height of the pandemic. I'm going to go rather quickly through these slides. This presentation was based on an earlier talk I gave, but we've cut it a little bit for time to allow time for a demo at the end. So for an agenda, I'm going to briefly cover safety data, some of the data sources that we used in the knowledge graph, some example analyses that we performed. Then I'll talk about the knowledge graph and its design. And finally, I'll move on to a demonstration of the knowledge graph. So with this audience, I'm sure there's some familiarity with these data sources already. Patient safety, of course, takes data from many sources, clinical trials, scientific literature, population statistics. But for this project, we really focused on just a few things. So this was a competitive vaccine safety program. And the emphasis was on administration or exposure data. So basically who got vaccines, and then adverse events associated with those vaccinations. And the focus was on AstraZeneca's vaccine, of course, Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen's vaccines were all present in the market during the time when we were performing these analyses. So at a high level, it certainly seems easy enough. We have vaccines, we have patients, we have adverse events, and it should be relatively easy to come up with things like, what's the most frequent adverse event and which vaccines did people receive. But the reality is really more complex. Patient is hidden behind case, so there's an abstraction in that cases are only reported for adverse events. We don't have information on all patients receiving the vaccines. Then previous vaccinations, the dose series, boosters, other medications, all of these things are largely, or can be largely invisible. They're sometimes captured, sometimes not. They're not captured reliably. Exposure and adverse events. So exposure data, as I mentioned, this is a population-oriented data set. So we'll get these as kind of summaries from geographic regions, geopolitical regions. It's usually in the form of total number of doses given, stratified by vaccine. Maybe there'll be information on second doses. This is the time when this system was operationalized. Of course, boosters were just being discussed. They hadn't happened yet. And there were lots of interesting questions around that we couldn't answer. As far as adverse event data, again, case reporting systems, we were using public systems for this project. These are case-oriented systems, meaning, again, we'll only see a report when someone has taken the time to submit one, either a physician, the patients themselves, their families, and so forth. And if we're lucky, we'll get the vaccine, of course, maybe some demographic information like age, sex of the patient, and so forth, some timing information, and of course, a set of adverse events. So if I look at the data that as it comes in from a high level, one of the systems that we used was VAERS, which is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This is a US government-run data collection on vaccine adverse events. It comes in a form that involves 3 files. There's a vaccine file, a case file, a symptom file. They're joined together based on IDs. And it provides a fairly comprehensive picture of all vaccines adverse events in the US since 1990. Also, I'll note that VAERS cases are copied or also provided to Hyve, which is the European adverse event reporting structure. And they are captured under a specific heading which allows us to exclude them to avoid double counting. So looking at Hyve, again, European CDC, and again, it's a government collection facility. Different format of data, which is typical of information that we get. In this case, we still have cases, but instead of 3 distinct files, we end up getting a single tabular file that has multi-valued fields. There's a concept of a reaction, which is the adverse event. It's a collection of MedDRA terms, preferred terms. Then there are the suspect medications, in this case filtered to one of the COVID-19 vaccines. And then occasionally we'll see concomitant medications, again, useful for doing some analysis, but not frequently populated, unfortunately. So the medication names are semi-structured, that they require some cleaning in order to work with them. The cases are basically at for the public data are just at the European Economic Area level. You can derive from the paid subscription to this information. You can get down to the country level, but again, the geographic region is quite broad. Let's move on. So quick overview of exposure data. So this is again who received vaccines. There's in the US, it's a vaccine-based view. There's state level distribution data and administration information. So basically which vaccines were administered. It's a big roll up down from a county level, but really the state level distribution is what we analyzed. Then there's basically there's a demographic based view that's also available, but it doesn't give you vaccine specific information. We focus primarily on the vaccine based view. Then and then a very small type at the bottom of the slide, which will be provided, are links to the data.gov site where these data can be obtained. For basically for the AstraZeneca vaccine, we were able to use a kind of a combined exposure file. So it included information from ECDC as well as individual countries reporting data. And there was a kind of a manual harmonization process for this, but it ended up kind of being mapped to a format similar to what is produced by ECDC. Again, country level, there's a lot of manual curation going on. And this was, of course, specific to the AstraZeneca vaccine. So I've talked a little bit about the structure of the data. So how about volume? So this was another reason that we went down the knowledge graph direction. We wanted to have a way to even handle the scale of the data coming in. So this is an interesting graph. This is a look at vaccine adverse event reports starting in 1990. So this is for all vaccines in the US. And you can see that COVID-19 adverse event reports dwarfed everything else, beginning in 2021, greater than all other vaccines combined, even vaccines that have been running for years. Like you can see in the table on the left-hand side that even things like the the flu vaccine, which has of course been tracked all the way since the beginning of VAERS, nowhere near the number of cases reported. And of course, the reason is that a lot of vaccines were administered. So it's not necessarily that there's any difference in safety profile, but you have kind of a situation of stimulated reporting and a lot of people receiving the vaccine. So we had a lot of volume of data to work with. I'll just speak briefly on publication cadence. So the AZ combined data was compiled on a daily basis. CDC also daily for administration information. VAERS was updated weekly, and vigilance every 3 days. And this is a problem in and of itself, in that you basically end up having to write a pipeline to keep up with these analyses. It's very much a moving target. So let's talk about the analyses now that you have an idea of the data that are going into them. So the main use case for this project was a weekly executive report that went all the way up to the CEO of AstraZeneca, and involved reporting a number of statistics around vaccine safety. Specifically, they wanted to see, based on vigilance and VAERS and combined exposure, CDC, and of course MEDRA terms, thrombocytopenia was a huge area of interest, because that ended up being an issue with the Janssen vaccine. Also, GBS and CVST were also being tracked. These were calculated on a weekly basis and rolled up in a report. And again, with all the data coming in, we wanted to make sure these numbers were accurate and that we were able to put the results together timely on a weekly basis. Of course, there are a lot of ad hoc questions too. Anything, looking at any particular demographics, was there anything interesting about age or other factors, for any questions of interest. So all of these regular reporting plus ad hoc questions were our kind of our workbench, if you will, of analyses that we needed to perform. So let's take a look at what a typical question looks like. So, the general form is really looking for, do the events that are observed, are they occurring more frequently than expected? First off, in the general population, then for specific age groups, maybe looking at countries in comparisons to other drugs and vaccines, especially true of this project, since it was very much driven by competitive analysis, looking to see how are the other vaccines doing comparing to AstraZeneca. And then other things like, well, we only are interested if there's in a certain period of time to onset. And of course, the results need to be provided as summary tables, visualizations, descriptives, any number of forms. So a lot of questions, a lot of things to be answered. So most of the analyses can be decomposed into questions like this. So there's a mode where we're kind of filtering cases based on a set of adverse events, preferred terms from MEDRA, basically, and then take a second case of interest, again, a set of adverse events, and intersecting those with terms of interest, return the intersection of these, and then of course stratify by different criteria, and then using aggregation, sums, averages, mins, max, and so forth. So again, the calculations are not terribly complicated, but you need to get the data in a form that you're able to do these calculations. So I call this slide reality check because I just presented what appeared to be a very straightforward analysis paradigm, but when you actually looked at the code that we were writing to address these questions, 80% of the code that we were writing was basically being repeated. So it was parsing the data, it was reorganizing it, cleaning, and only about 20% of the code was actually the actual calculations. And I won't go into this picture in detail here, but it's basically a representation of the notion of you loading a file, restructuring various columns, reorganizing them, renaming them, extracting things, to finally get to a data frame or tabular structure where you can perform calculations. So in summary for the analyses, at a weekly reporting going all the way to the senior executive team, based again on vigilance, VAERS, AZ exposure, CDC exposure, and measured data. And analysis, really, it's filtering on populations and conditions of interest and statistical tests, visualizations and tables. But the reality is that a lot of code was in data parsing, cleaning, and organizing. So we approached this problem by building a knowledge graph. And first of all, I'll just briefly touch on this. I know the audience appears to be to have at least some knowledge graph background already, but for this, then you know that there's really two fundamental components of a knowledge graph, this question of nodes and edges. And nodes and edges support key value properties. So that means that for every concept or item that you want to put into a knowledge graph, you can associate texts and numbers and lists and so forth with each of those nodes. And then edges link those nodes together. And the key point here is that the knowledge graph is a very flexible general purpose data structure, and it allows you to rapidly model information without having to spend a large amount of time up front doing your initial design of the data structures. And we'll see this in a little bit. But how does this help with patient safety? So the knowledge graph is really an ontology plus data. So in this case, the ontology is MedDRA, as well as other information. And we want to be able to take all of the crazy array of data that we're getting in and map them into nodes. So we have cases and vaccines and medicines and MedDRA concepts. And then we want to capture from the source data base relationships. So who, administration, adverse events, and so forth, and map those in. And the beauty of the knowledge graph approach is we're able to do this incrementally and to focus on the items that we need for those sets of analyses that I described earlier. So this is the, again, I won't spend too much time here, but this is the model that we used for all of these analyses. And I'll just touch briefly on a couple of things. You'll see here that even if you're not familiar with graph models, all of these bubbles contain things that you probably are familiar with. So I mentioned exposure data, vaccines, of course, cases, MedDRA terms. In fact, we actually put the entire MedDRA hierarchy into the database to make it easier for doing analysis. And we also built a couple of kind of special cases where we gathered things that were being asked of specifically, like we had our own definition of thrombocytopenia. We were able to capture that into a collection of MedDRA queries that were customized. And we were able to quickly put these into a data structure that we could compute on. We didn't have to spend a lot of time building a large set of relational tables and doing all the relational modeling. We were basically able to extract the key concepts that we were interested in and start building relationships between them, and then building a little code to populate or fill this data structure with data from the base sources. So let's talk about using PSKG. So now hopefully I left myself enough time for a brief demo. I'll have a couple of slides here first, but then I'll actually show the database in action. So again, quickly, an ontology described earlier is a directed graph. So that means those nodes are in a relationship that are ordered. And PSKG is built on Neo4j, which I'll be showing in a minute. It's a graph database that is built on this directed graph model. And it uses a query language called Cypher. And Cypher is the way to effectively formulate patterns which you use to address questions of interest. And let's take a look at a very simple query. So the base statement in Cypher is match. And so what you do is you basically say, well, I'm interested in cases. In this case, I'd like to look for cases coming from vigilance. I'm interested in cases that have previous versions. That was an artifact of the vigilance data as it was being produced, that basically they would produce a case and then there might be an update to that case. So if I were to put that in a relational database, I'd be looking at maybe 2 tables and so forth. But here I can just describe that I've got a concept of a case, and there may be previous versions, and I want to put a link between them. And the way that I traverse them is basically saying, find me a case. I want the data source to be Hyve. I'd like to go back previous versions, up to 2 previous versions, and return the result. And I get back a graph. So again, very simple. The idea is that you build a notion of patterns, and then you apply those patterns to a live database. So let's see. I won't show this query here. We'll flip over to the demo, but what you do is you build up queries in terms of sequences of match statements. So you'll say, find some set of interest, find another set. You can then join them or combine them, or use the first set as a kind of a initial filter to build more queries on top. So at this point, I'm going to change my share here and see if I can flip over to the to my screen, and then we will take a look at a query running in action. Okay, and I'm going to make this bigger. So let's see if I can make sure that this is actually operating correctly. Yep. Okay, so once I get once this cleared, we should be able to see. Okay, so what you're looking at here is, I'll give you a caveat. This graph is running on my ancient Mac, basically my Mac Pro, and it's doing the best that it can. And I loaded it only with some VAERS data for purposes of demonstration. So any counts and things that you see, please consider these as demonstration data, even though they're derived from VAERS. So on the left-hand side, there's a collection of the nodes that are part of the model. You saw that in the graph, or the projection earlier, of the set of design for the ontology of the graph. And these are just listed here as little bubbles. Then each of the relationships are also listed. And I have some queries that I had pre-run earlier just to kind of get things started. So these are Medra terms. So I basically have a match statement here. Again, I mentioned that was the key statement in Cypher. And so I said, just find me all of the Medra preferred terms. I want to return them as a graph. So I just say I return this node, which is what I've just matched. And I say, just give me 25 of them just to start. And so you can see on the screen, there's and I'll zoom out a little bit, it had returned a number of results. But the interesting thing here is that in this browsing interface, I can choose this particular preferred term. And again, this is just nothing special about this. I had only just asked for a selection of Medra terms. But I can immediately ask the database, well, what is this connected to? And if I zoom out slightly, you'll see that all of these kind of purple bubbles, or lavender bubbles, are actually cases. And so these are all adverse event cases that were reported that happen to mention this Medra term. And so in addition to the cases, I can quickly ascertain if there's something of interest. I can poke around and I can navigate this structure, and I can see, if I zoom in a little closer, I'll make it a little easier to see. So Neo4j colors the graphs. Here, let me make this a little bigger, it'll be even easier. Colors the nodes that come back, and so it makes them easier to to kind of view in a visual sense. But in addition to the cases, I also have things like, oh, this particular item is part of basically a pre-composed query from Medra. So that's another piece of interesting information. And then, of course, preferred terms are linked to high-level terms, and then from high-level to high-level group terms, and that's also captured here. So this gives me a very quick and easy way to explore the data interactively, especially when I'm kind of just looking for maybe something that's an anomaly, something that's unexpected. it's easy for me to quickly, view things on let's call it a singular basis. So I'm going to zoom out again to show the main screen. I'm going to run a second query here, and again, I'll make this larger in a second. But the key point here is that I'm able to take information and start with something very simple. Like, for instance, what if I just want to find the preferred terms that occur most frequently across cases, okay? And so I can say, find me cases and terms, and then I effectively can summarize this result in terms of a collection of measured terms and a number of times they occur, and I'll capture this and I'll just rename that count as top PT cases. I can say, give me that list back, ordered by the cases in descending order, and I'll say limit to the top 5. So this first part returns the set of the most frequently occurring terms. Then I can take those terms and say, well, now find me all the cases in VAERS that have those preferred terms, those top 5 preferred terms, and return to me basically the term itself, the patient gender, and the count of cases. So basically stratifying by the term and by sex, and return the number of cases. And in this case, instead of getting and I'll make this a little bigger, instead of getting back a graph as I did in the previous example, I can actually pull back a table. And the table, of course, can be, here I'm using it sort of interactively, but the same result set can be projected into a statistical analysis program. It can be projected as a Python or R data frame, and then you can do subsequent analysis or visualizations. So basically a tabular result similar to this was how I developed that graph that you saw earlier, the number of cases of non-COVID-19 vaccines versus COVID-19 vaccines. So this gives you an idea of the flexibility of what you can do within Neo4j. Again, the part that makes it, I think, a departure from maybe what you're familiar with in, say, working with a relational database, is that you're able to kind of decompose your question into simpler parts, and each of those simple parts can then be combined. This is effectively a little pipeline, right? In that, I'm going to gather this first set of results, I'm going to pass it as the input to the next set of patterns that I wish to match. And by doing so, I can build up very complex questions with just a few lines of code that shares, by the way, a lot of keywords with SQL. And this allows you to very rapidly, first of all, answer interesting questions, which of course is the most important part. But secondly, you can begin answering questions almost immediately. And as someone who's also done a lot of work within relational databases, excuse me, you have to have a lot of information or a lot of knowledge on the table structures of the database that you wish to analyze. Whereas here, you just kind of need to know the nodes and the edges, and the entire structure of the database, you can kind of focus on just the pieces that you need rather than having to have a holistic view. So I find this is a very powerful way to navigate and work with data. So I'm going to zoom back out briefly. I want to emphasize, so far I've been showing just examples of looking at nodes or looking for nodes. The other aspect of a knowledge graph that's interesting is that, and this is again another departure from relational databases, is that all aspects of the graph are things that you can navigate. So in this top example here, I'd pull up a measure preferred term, and I looked for information that was linked to it. I can do the same thing with pulling up examples, and let me zoom and make this a little bigger. So what I just did was I clicked on this button here, which is Medra link, and that's one of the relationships that's in the database. And I'll zoom this in so you can see it. And I basically said, bring me back a sampling of things that use that linking structure. So in this case, there are a collection of low-level terms that are linking to MedDRA preferred terms. And the interesting thing is that I was actually able to query the relationship as opposed to querying the data, if that makes sense. The relationships in a knowledge graph are data as well, and they're fully computable. And this is a very powerful way to perform analysis and investigation. One of the queries I won't show here today, just because I was only able to put a small subset of data on, and the result set isn't very interesting. But the question was, someone asked, for all of the administration data that I have, what stratifications are available? Now, if you think about this, if these data were organized in a relational database, you'd probably be reading data dictionaries and trying to ascertain, probably even manually, what columns were available for doing stratifications. In this case, and it's actually possible to query the knowledge graph itself and have the knowledge graph tell you which stratifications are available. So again, this is another interesting departure from relational databases in that everything in the graph is computable. So I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I'm going to just show one last thing, and then we'll move back. I mentioned that there's every one of these structures in the database, the nodes and edges, basically has a set of information that you can link to it. So these aren't particularly interesting. They're just these are just low-level term information. So this is information derived directly from MedDRA itself. If I go back up here, though, to this query that returned a number of cases, so here I'm looking at this various case. If I have this node selected, you can see all of the data that I've associated with this node. And all of these attributes are queryable, and I can do things like, okay, what is the, and the way we model the database for ranges or age ranges, because some of our data sources don't give an exact age. So we have even though VAERS does, I can basically record information such as the patient's age, the patient's gender. All of these information are in these nodes and are also queryable using those same match statements. So in addition to querying the structure, basically, specifying, what matches on various node links, it's also possible to both extract and query based on these attributes. So I'm going to zip back to the presentation for a couple last slides, and then we'll kind of wrap up. I'm going to see if I can find my way back to Safari, and I'm going to switch my share back to the presentation. Okay, great. So I'm going to go back to the end here. I've already mentioned that Cypher, you can use it interactively, as I was just demonstrating, but also there are Python and R bindings, and for Spotfire users and other Tableau users as well, it's possible to directly query the graph. So in summary, the code that we developed for this particular knowledge graph, first of all, the first observation is it's fast. In fact, it was 250 times faster than the code that we rewrote, kind of single-purpose code in Python and R. Secondly, the analysis code, since we refactored out all the pipeline and parsing and harmonization of information, each of those analyses shrunk in size to about 90% less code. And the insight generation was about 3 times faster. And I noticed that Elpida already posted the link to the preprint. If you want to get more information and more sample queries and more information about this work, a manuscript is in process. There's a preprint available there. That same link is going to switch to the actual published paper when the reviewer is finished with us. So anyways, I think that's all I have. So I'll stop here, and then Elpida, I guess, do we want to take a few questions, or do you want to start the panel?
So, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing this presentation. So I can see there are already some questions available for you. So maybe let's take a couple of minutes to answer them. Well, first of all, there is a questions around the code availability. So I assume you can share, Andrew, a link to the public GitHub repository for the
I will, yes. Yep. I don't have it handy at the moment, but I will be happy to provide that to you, and you can definitely publicize that.
Fantastic. Yeah. In any case, we will follow up with all the participants so we can provide this, no problem. And yeah, maybe we've got time for another question around any alternatives to Neo4j as a graph database solution, and Cypher as the query language that you demonstrated, and any incentives or drawbacks to using such alternatives?
Yeah, so this particular project was developed with Cypher and Neo4j because that was the what the main graph group at AstraZeneca was using. It's but it's only one of very many tools that are available for doing this type of work. I would say that Cypher and Neo4j fall into the category of pattern-based knowledge graph tools, meaning that it's very oriented towards answering connection type questions. There are, of course, many other graph databases and technologies which are based on different formulations. These are generally based on description logics, and you may have heard terms like Sparkle and so forth. Those are also alternative representations, just as powerful, and with various tools and learning curve to pick up. I would say that one advantage of Cypher is that it's very simple. So again, it's only one of many tools, and there are also other databases other than Neo4j that support the Cypher standard for query language. But of course, there are also many other ways to query, both build and query graphs.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think looking at the time, it's good to go to the next part of the webinar. So for our panel discussion, I would like to invite on stage and introduce my colleague, Eelke van der Horst. So Eelke is a semantic modeling expert in the research data management team here at the Hyve. And he has a long year experience in advising and supporting pharma clients in building knowledge graphs and semantic models. So Eelke, welcome, and great to have you here with us.
Yeah, thanks, Elpida.
All right, so to kick off this part, I would like to start by mentioning what Andrew's presentation provided to us. Yeah, it gave us a very good idea of the revolution that is currently ongoing for some years in data management and analytics in the pharma industry, and also like a lot of opportunities in terms of providing summary statistics and providing better tools for analyzing the data, but also interacting with the data. Yeah, I think like especially in the context of drug safety monitoring that Andrew presented, it's very nice, especially for the patient safety knowledge graph, that it becomes more straightforward to integrate data sources coming from different parts, like from different regulatory agencies, as Andrew showcased, but also vaccine exposure information coming from CDC. And yeah, that's a very good use case for knowledge graphs. And in that sense, we can see graphs as a vehicle for data integration. But extrapolating this idea, I think this need of integrating disparate sources of information becomes apparent not only in drug safety, but more generally in the pharma industry. And many times we need data that are being produced in different parts of the drug development pipeline. And this also often comes with challenges. And I would like to start with Eelke and having his view on the role of knowledge graphs in this breaking of down data silos and enabling this data integration and collaboration across the different data domains in the pharma.
Yeah, thanks, Elpida. In pharma, as in many other industries, data is usually siloed. It lives within departments or groups, but is also locked into applications. And knowledge graphs provide a very nice view or a nice structure to get an integrated view on available data. Knowledge graphs have links. They provide means to add meaning to your data, and of course, a graph data structure is ideal to represent any data in a form you like. Of course, there is some effort involved, as Andrew also showed. You should think about mapping data from these disparate systems, aligning it, cleaning, converting it. But once you have data from systems available in a knowledge graph, this integrated view, your data scientist will thank you for it, because you can extract, as Andrew showed, data in any form or structure you like. And also, once you have your data from different data domains and groups and applications in a knowledge graph, it allows you to trace data across the drug development pipeline. Usually, data is communicated between departments through PowerPoint presentations or emails. But this gives you really competitive advantage in doing business analysis. And another point is more organizational. Once you start building a knowledge graph and attempting to integrate these different data domains, people start talking to each other. So in that way, it also breaks silos and aligns on data standards or a common way of doing data management.
Yeah, fantastic. Indeed, what you described basically around how these knowledge graph solutions can enable more of a better accessibility to the data, also linking across different data domains within pharma, annotating better your data, kind of reminds me a lot about this demand and need for fair practices within pharma. And this concept of having your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And central idea around to support this fair data management is providing good metadata. For that, I think knowledge graphs can be very well suited to accommodate that. So I would also love to hear your thoughts on that. Andrew, if you want to touch upon fair data management and knowledge graphs.
Yeah, I think there's really a key issue there, or key point, which is that in a sense, one of the ways to make data more accessible is to make the structure really visible. And that's something that knowledge graphs, that's like a first class feature of knowledge graphs is that the data that you the data that you put into it, that it's very easy to communicate the structure of that data to anyone, even people without technical backgrounds. I've been in situations where if you even take a very well documented, very well defined production database, relational database, you may have to spend hours looking at table definitions, lists of documents and so forth that support various columns and column names and how things are joined together. And it is very challenging because you quickly realize that you have to first be familiar with the data themselves and with the structure or the mapping of that data into the relational model. So immediately you've got about twice the work to do to communicate the structure of the data to someone who really is not really interested so much in how you've modeled it relationally. They're very interested in asking and answering questions. And so in that sense, to me, knowledge graphs are a huge win for FAIR because they really democratize data. They make it much easier to get your hands on and get started doing the things you're actually wanting to do, which is answer questions.
Great. And I have I sense that Eelke has a kind of a similar idea around that, but yeah, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say, Eelke.
Yeah, I agree with Andrew. And people might not have missed that FAIR and knowledge graphs have a lot in common. Having your data in a knowledge graph makes it ultimately findable, also indexed, and of course, knowledge graph also built on this interoperability using a format for knowledge representation for data and metadata, the use of qualified references, all these things. But I would also say that it's also the other way around, that having fair data at the source also facilitates and speeds up building knowledge graphs.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's all about trying to generate data and have systems in place that have a more of a data-centric mindset rather than this application-centric view that also, like Andrew was talking a bit before. So yeah, once I'd like now to shift and touch upon another thing that was very much highlighted in Andrew's presentation around being able to extract counts and aggregates so that you can perform your analysis in an easier way using a knowledge graph. But also the adoption of knowledge graphs, I think, enables us to perform another types of analysis, so graph analytics and network analytics, and build ML, like machine learning and AI applications in a way that cannot be supported using a relational data model. So yeah, for that, I would really love to hear the ideas of Andrew a bit on what are the benefits and what is the next step that can be done once we have a knowledge graph in place in terms of using predictive analytics and network analytics, any potential use cases that you can think of for drug safety monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so I'll start with a simple practical example, which is, we have a lot of new techniques now for doing, massive analysis on very wide data sets, right? This is the power of machine learning to go through and look at, let's say a case that has 40,000 features and to extract useful information. So one of the most practical benefits of a knowledge graph is that, unlike a situation where you, say, have modeled relationally, say you have 3 or 4 really good algorithms or advanced analytics, as people like to say, rather than machine learning, but it's machine learning. And you have that output and you produce those things. Where do you put that in your data? It's not the source data. This is derived data. You want to be able to capture that, the notion that it is derived, yet you want to version it. You want to make it very clear that it's the way it was derived and so forth. A knowledge graph gives you a way to do this. It gives you the place to put it, meaning that, oh, we can add a couple of nodes to the graph that capture that representation, but that don't interfere with what would be happening in a relational structure when you'd be like, well, do we make another table? Do we add 5 more columns? Oh, we can't do that because it breaks something else. It gives you a very practical, so that's kind of on the low end, is that one, it gives you a place to put things. I think the other place that makes it very interesting for doing this is that, especially with large language models and other things that are of interest right now, the ability for the knowledge graph to capture and present a corpus of knowledge which is well curated so that you can have your models run and produce valid results. You now have a better place to derive that information from. You can be very confident in where it comes from and how it's managed. And so I think those two things, kind of set the stage for doing this. Then as far as use cases are concerned, we started looking into this a little bit, in that it's almost kind of bordering more on epidemiology, but the notion that, all right, we have these kind of hard facts, adverse events coming in for cases and so forth, and we've got administration data and things. But we can also look at things like, wow, that's interesting. We have an adverse event associated with a potentially a concomitant medication. Maybe we should derive a link, and we'll note a confidence interval around it, saying, there's a small probability that any patient who has this other drug, who happens to get this vaccine, may have an adverse event. We can map that into the knowledge graph, again, noting it very clearly. It's not source data, it's derived, but it's there for analytical purposes that you can then explore using Cypher and other tools. And so I think that's really the beginnings of the use case. There is this notion that you can combine data sets that already exist by applying other information, maybe from literature, maybe through a model, maybe through both, record those, and then be able to actively query and structure them without breaking everything else in the database, which is really essential.
Great. Yeah, I mean, this use case scenario that you provided on being able to support signal evaluation in pharmacovigilance with the knowledge graphs is, I think, a great one. So yeah, we are getting closer to the end of this session. I would like to thank you both, Andrew and Eelke, for participating. And to our audience, also thank you for your attendance and engagement. We hope that this webinar has served as a source of inspiration for your organizations, whether you are currently considering the adoption of knowledge graphs, or whether you are already facing the challenges and benefits we described today. So I hope to see you in one of our upcoming sessions, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.